Thank you very much, Elias. And I definitely want to take your questions as well, but I'm going to start off with a theoretical question which relates to the extractive inclusive distinction. You talked about Bill Gates and you juxtaposed him to Carlos Slim. Now we have very powerful monopoly companies in the US, or at least companies with a very powerful monopoly position in their fields like Google, Facebook, Amazon. And the regulatory decision there seems to me that because they are very innovative and because they bring prices down or actually even offer free products for consumers, then that's okay. And I wanted to see what you think about that context. Is that an inclusive context? Is it a concern that the amount of economic power that these companies are amassing is dangerous, perhaps even to democracy?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern. I think people don't really know how to regulate these industries. And, there's a question as to whether or not that scene, of Bill Gates being dragged in front of antitrust is possible now also. There's a question about whether these people are so powerful now, that you can't really enforce rules against them. But I have to say that, the most optimistic thing I can think of about in that context is, I have a son who's 16, and Facebook is for losers. If you're 16, no one uses Facebook. No 16-year-old uses Facebook.
It's passé.
It's totally passé. That you look at that space, there's just innovation all over the place. Like it's, this. So that makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that there is still a lot of competition and innovation, and Mark Zuckerberg can't block you. But obviously there's all of these network externalities that give him, immense power. Yeah.
Elias, before we get to Greece, is there a comment you'd like to make on that?
No.
Okay. Well, one question I'd like to ask about Greece is, we're here now, we're quote unquote out of the crisis, the bailouts are over, but we had 3 of them, all the other countries needed 1. We had a massive depression and huge external pressure to change, including, structural, there was pressure for structural change. And there's a sense that many people have that in Greece, the old system proved remarkably resilient. So I guess the question is to both of you, can a country whose institutions were already problematic and have been corrupted further find the way out of the trap, and where will it find it?
Jim, that's a hard question.
I
defer to you.
Yeah, so I would say, based on reading your book and the things the homework that Elias gave me before the conference to read, I would say, and your talk.
It's all rigged, isn't it?
There's
this discussion.
I mean, there's no, if I thought about that picture, I showed you the picture of Supervisor Cowperthwaite. Like where did that come from? That came from a political project to kind of build state institutions. In our book, we talk a lot about this glorious revolution. It was a political project to reform the state. Okay, there were loads of vested interests in the old way of doing things in Britain before 1688. There was tax farming. There were loads of people making money from tax farming. They didn't want a bureaucratic tax administration figure. Rich people didn't want their assets evaluated. And you know how they dealt with that? Rich people in England, what did they have? Land. So that's the excise tax system. What about the land system? They didn't do a thing. They never bureaucratized land tax. In the 18th century, land tax they left the rich people alone. The excise tax fell on poor people. Bread, beer, butter, like ordinary consumption goods that poor people consume. They taxed poor people, powerless. But they invested in public goods. They got the revenues. They built state institutions. So I would say, I would separate this into 2 things, like conditional on having a political project to really improve institutions. We know a lot about the impediments to that and what strategies work. There's many examples, as Elias says, in history of, there's always people opposed to change and reform, but there's ways of getting around that. And there's lots of precedents for doing that. And that's exactly what happened after the Glorious Revolution. So we know a lot about strategy. But what we don't understand as social scientists nearly so well is where this comes from. Like, where do these projects come from to, like, state? You know, in the Estonian case, and I think that's, you know, that's something, the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's all these Russians, we've got to build institutions, we've got to stay autonomous, we've got to protect ourselves, we've got to, you know, but the most depressing thing that I learned, you know, reading this stuff is that all of this kind of swinging austerity that Greece has had to put up with has not made it easy for a political project or a political coalition to emerge that really addresses these institutional problems. Instead, everyone gets completely distracted by this, you know, legitimate conflicts with the troika or whatever. But that just distracts you from where you should be putting your emphasis. So I think I don't know the answers to this. I think, you know, if I wrote a list of these, it's very idiosyncratic where these things come from. You know, it's maybe geopolitics, or it's, you know, or it's ideology, it's you know, it's religion even. You know, some English historians would say the Glorious Revolution was driven by the fact that, you know, you didn't want to have a Catholic king. So that I think we understand that not so well.
Okay, Ilya.
So I just want to follow on Jim's point. Many of the drugs for serious institutional reform are not present anymore. Some are, but some are not. First of all, now the fiscal situation has improved considerably. Mm-hmm. No matter which party you will vote, the next finance minister will run a primary fiscal surplus. The trade imbalances have been corrected, and an increasing number of the Greek people have now come to realize that there are deeper issues that prevent firms to grow and be more productive. It prevents foreign capital, and this foreign capital doesn't have to be from non-Greeks, it can also be from Greeks, to arrive in Greece. And effectively what we need was to say that we need something like Reload Greece, but for the state. So I'm more optimist, if you like, than pessimist, because some of the drugs and the impediments are not there.
Yeah. And I assume also that all of this austerity has eliminated a lot of the vested interests in the initial system a decade ago.
In a sense, even though, you know, some would argue that new vested interests have been created and they are even stronger than before because the state, in a sense, is weaker than before. But I'd like to throw it open to questions from all of you. Don't be shy. You're being shy.
Or tired.
Or tired. Ah, I see a hand back there. Andrea, wait for the microphone.
Can you hear me? Good. Mm-hmm. I just want to ask, what role do you think education has to play with the concepts that you mentioned? Because I think that's a big issue for Greece, and I'm not sure whether that kind of is a big part of how you think institutions can be corrected.
Okay, the role of education in achieving this kind of emergence from the rut we're in.
Actually, you give a great example of a case of an institutional failure. Having studied in Greece, in the US, and in the UK, what tends to differ across those three educational systems is the degree of politicization, let's say, in the universities. So the session on venture capital and seed funding, very eloquently giving succinct examples presented of the great talent in mathematics, in engineering, core science that exists in Greek universities. The problem of the Greek universities is not of funding, is actually of an institutional failure.
James, is there something you want to tell us about the role that education plays in general in a project to move from an extractive to an inclusive state?
Well, I think my view is sort of well articulated by Elias earlier, which is that you know, of course, education is incredibly important, but you know, education is a kind of outcome of more fundamental institutions. You know, and I think, you know, what you're describing about the universities, I'd say, like everywhere I've been in the world, you know, universities reflect the institutions of society. You know, you go into a university in Africa or Latin America, and they all have the same problems. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, the Greek universities are where you learn rent-seeking 101. You know, you learn that you have to join a political party in order to get all sorts of preferential treatment.
I just wanted to follow up a bit.
Introduce yourself as well, please. Professor?
Yeah,
Distinguished professor.
Distinguished professor.
Yes, I'm Dimitris Papaioannou, actually one of the editors of the book that Elias showed at the very end. So have worked with Elias as well. So I wanted to follow up on the discussion, on the question that Yannis asked the two speakers, and ask James a bit more generally, kind of, what are the, you said that we know quite a bit about the conditions under which reform kind of takes place, and we can go from a more extractive system to a more inclusive system. So what do you think are the most kind of the most important such preconditions for countries to change themselves and the people those who own their rents to eventually give them up?
No, I think what I said is that I think conditional on having a sort of political project to reform institutions, we know a lot about what strategies are successful or what strategies you can use to get around impediments. But I think the difficult thing is, if you have a society, I mean, Greece is not like Zimbabwe. Greece is a very functional, vibrant democracy, but the democracy interacts in perverse ways with the weak state, in terms of clientelism and, so that makes it very difficult to get a kind of political movement based on, this reform agenda. It could happen, but as I said, there's all these other issues which make it very hard, macroeconomic austerity and populism and the troika that make it very difficult to focus on these issues, So I think that's that's exactly that's something we don't understand. Is like, and I think austerity is definitely neither necessary nor sufficient for that. Like, look at Argentina. Every 10 years, Argentina has a swinging macroeconomic crisis. GDP falls 10%, 15%. Then the soybean price comes back, and 10 years later, the same thing happens. There's never any institutional reform in Argentina. The same system goes on and on and on, and it has done since the 1940s. So I think that's, and I don't know enough about Greece to understand like what could precipitate that. But it seems like a national discussion is like where you start. You have to be talking about it. You have to get people focused on it. That's the role of the media and scholars and business people and like here's the problem. Obviously there's many different sorts of voices, but that's got to be a collective project by society, it seems to me,
Actually, if I was just to add on what Jim said, I think that the mistake I have made, and actually we have made collectively, is that we have tended to have like a paternalistic approach. Or we go like from the ivory tower and from downtown London or from Boston, and we lecture people, on how to behave, while those are the people who face the inefficient state, the clientelistic political system, the inefficient courts every day. And I think a project has, as Jim pointed out, it has to be on the focus. So now we did fiscal prudence. Let's try now to focus on this. And the solution will not come necessarily from London or from a particular area of Athens where most of us hang out, but it will come by interacting with the people, learning from them. And I think there's also a lot of research now looking at the Trump phenomenon, making the point that perhaps a mistake of the liberal elite, academic, business, establishment more generally, was that you were going to the white middle class, the lower middle class, and you were lecturing on them of what were the mistakes that they were doing. So I think the focus has to be to engage rather than to segregate.
In any case, we don't have the troika to blame anymore, so we will have to focus on our own mistakes. Παρακαλώ.
Hello. Hi, I'm Sophia, and I work on employee engagement and culture shift. So what you described reminds me of things we do for employees. So it looks like Greek people are employees of Greece as a company, and somehow we need a cultural shift. So I want to know, what do you think are those characteristics people should now abide by? What the value should be of this new culture, and what type of activity should we do to get there?
And we'll take another question from the lady in the front, and then we have to wrap up.
So I have a question for Elias.
You are?
I'm RG. I work at BlackRock. I'm a VP at the tax structuring department. And my question to you is that since you propose that maybe a fourth bailout institutional program would be something that might help Greece to get out of the crisis. I was thinking, how realistic you think this option is for Greece at the moment, and what if this doesn't happen? What do you think is there for Greece? Does it mean that we're getting to a 0.0, or what? I mean, based on your experience, what do you think is going to happen?
You want to start with that?
Okay, let me start with that, and then Jim, you answer the culture versus institutions hard questions. So,
the hard question.
In a nutshell, I think that Greece needs this institutional bailout. I think it has to involve the society. It has to be multifaceted, and there are going to be back and forths, and somehow the society has to convince people to engage on that. If this does not happen, my forecast, actually, let me give you the boring academic question from an academic economist. If the institutions and the rules of the game do not improve, Greece will remain one of the poorest EU member countries. This is the steady state. That's like the stupid word that we use. This is what the fundamentals imply. And growth will fluctuate a bit around this level, which, of course, this is not what we want. And why this will happen? Some amazing firms I learned about today, they will leave. Some very good entrepreneurs, some very good academics will come and innovate in this country or in some other country. And therefore, the Greek society will fluctuate in the Greek economy at this level of income per capita, which should be a shame.
Yeah, I totally agree. I will answer. I'm not avoiding the culture question, but I totally agree with that. When I was reading Yannis's book, I sent him an email and I said, I work a lot in Colombia. My wife is Colombian. I teach in Colombia every year. I was reading his book and I said, take out the guns and the drugs. This is like Colombia. Everything, like everything.
In fact, maybe don't take out the drugs.
The judicial, the way the tax system works, the judicial system, the way people interact with the state, it's just like Colombia, And every summer when I teach in Bogota, I start my first lecture, I say, okay, all these Colombian students, I'm going to tell you about the iron law of 18%. 18%, what's that? In 1900, Colombian income per capita was 18% of the US level. And today, Colombian income per capita is 18% of the US level. So this is stable. It's a steady state. It's inequitous. The country is performing. There's no reason why Colombia or Greece wouldn't have the same level of income per capita as the United States, and Greece has enormous advantages over Colombia. So I'm not really comparing Greece
and
to Colombia.
Cultures and institutions in 75 seconds.
I just wanted to kind of say that I thought that was exact. I totally agree with that answer that Elias gave. I mean, I don't use the word culture. In some sense, that's what Gates and Slim is supposed to, get across. It's not that, Carlos Slim actually, his family are Lebanese, So it's not that it's the Lebanese or the Mexicans or or Gates or the Anglo-Saxons. Gates tried to do exactly the same thing, and Facebook and everybody else are also trying to do the same. Everyone wants to be a monopolist. We want to be intellectual monopolists, But there's competition and there's, checks and balances, and so I don't think there's anything wrong. I think to me, the only thing, I don't think there's anything stopping Greek being economically successful, which has to do with the culture. I think people adapt to environments, obviously, and things get normalized and stuff. But think of all the Greeks overseas. Greek people are incredibly successful economically all over the world. So it's just in Greece that they don't do so well. It's like Indians. India is incredibly successful, except in India. And that's because of the institutions and the incentives and patterns of opportunities it creates. So I don't think it's a story about culture.
On that note, let's thank our speakers very warmly.